To tie up a favorite fly today, this is John Barr's meat whistle. It was originally tied for trout, and he's done very well with it, as have other people for trout, but I have used it mostly as a warm water pattern. In my quest for nice flies for the warm water species that I frequent, I ran across the meat whistle years ago, and right about that time, John Barr came out with a book called Barr Flies, which he shows you how to tie this as well as some other flies he's done, including the slump buster, which I did a video I think a couple years ago on. I'll have a link in the description for that. But this is the meat whistle. It's a pretty simple fly once you understand all the pieces and parts to it. A couple of interesting techniques that make this work. That's the meat whistle. I'll go ahead and get started tying. I'm going to start the meat whistle by placing my hook in the vise. This is a Gamakatsu. It's a 60411 90-degree jig hook that is a size 1/0. The recipe in John Barr's book calls for a 1/0, 2/0, or 3/0. And he actually has also specific sizes for the cones that he puts on them. This is a copper cone in a small size. And I put it in the vise simply to debarb it and then put the cone on the hook. Really didn't have to debarb it. The cone, the opening on it is big enough to get over that barb. But I just wanted to show that because generally when you're putting beads or cones onto hooks like this, you have to do that as a matter of course to get it around the barb there. So for thread, I'm going to attach my thread, and for thread I'm using a UTC 140 Denier in brown. As you can see, part of the problem is that this cone will go over that 90-degree bend right up to the eye there. So what we're going to do first is we're going to attach our thread right at that bend, and we're going to produce a little bump right here for that cone to wedge itself up against to keep it from going around that corner and stopping it from doing that, and keep it wedged up there while we are tying the fly. So what you want to do is just a little bit behind that corner, start building up a bump like this. Careful with your thread. It'll sometimes slide around on you. You can help some of that by putting some wax on this. It will grip the other thread just a little bit better and stay in place more. You just want to get a little bump right there. Test it. When you get it big enough so that the cone doesn't go over it, see that still goes over it, then you're all set. That should be big enough. Yeah, that'll do it. Our resulting fly will be kind of wedged right up against that. I'm just putting in a quick whip finish so I can detach the thread. So I'm just putting a little bit of head cement on those thread wraps to help hold that together. That will set up while we're getting our other components together here. I'll wedge that right up there, and that's just going to sit there like that pretty much for the remainder of tying the fly. I'm going to reattach my thread along the hook shank right behind that cone, and once I get that secured, I'm tying in the rib as well as the body. The rib on this is just a copper wire. This is a medium copper wire. The body is a sparkle braid. This is a copper sparkle braid. I'm simply tying these in up here by the cone so that as I'm wrapping down the hook shank, I've got to go down the hook shank anyway to start. The wire will start here, I should say. The rib will start back here, and then the body will wrap forward. Since I'm going down the hook shank anyway, I might as well just secure all of this along the hook shank underneath these thread wraps. I'm going to go just a little bit past the barb, maybe just a little down the bend there. Bring my thread back up. I'm going to be right up against, right behind that cone. Apply the sparkle braid. Sparkle braid simply gives it a little bit of a flash on the bottom. You think of this as kind of like a sculpin or a sucker or something like this, a small fish on the bottom. They're going to have a little bit lighter color underneath, maybe a little bit of brightness, and this is just kind of helping with that. Now I'm going to put in just a 2 or 3 turn whip finish here, and this is to kind of help secure the thread, simply because the next step I have to take the hook out of the vise. The wing on this, or you could look at it as the back of the meat whistle, is a rabbit zonker strip. And what we have to do is we have to measure more or less that hide's going to go up on this side here, and it's going to go right up next to the cone. So right about here is where I'm going to have to pierce that hide with the hook. I'm going to go just a little bit beyond that, and I'll show you why in just a second. But I'm going to take that zonker strip, that hide, and I'm just going to push it down right onto the hook shank, to the hook point, I should say, like that. Now I have to take this out of the vise to get that zonker strip around the bend. Then I'll put it back in the vise to secure it. Now we can tie it in. See, that hide comes right down the back of the body, flips over, and you have all that hair up as kind of a wing. I'm going to separate this hair right here where I'm going to tie that in right behind the cone. The reason why I have a little bit of extra here, this is kind of stretchy, but a little bit extra here is it just makes it easier for me to pull that and then bind this in right in tight behind that cone. Don't worry about wasting this little bit of hair and rabbit. We're going to actually use that in just a little bit. But you'll see now that hide is right tight up against that cone. And now we have our tail. I should say we have our wing and tail. I'm going to trim the hide about the length of the body. I want the tail, all this hair sticking back for the tail right here. I want it pretty much about the length of the hook, maybe a little longer, but that hide, you're going to trim the hide just a little short because that hair will still flow behind it like this. Now we're going to put in our rib, and this is just simply, if you've ever tied like a matuka or something like that, basically the same thing. You're going to rabbit hair floating all over the place. You're going to separate the hair on the hide and bring that wire over. We'll do this in about 4, maybe 5 wraps. Some people don't do this step, and you certainly don't if you don't want to. I would say it's optional. I do think, though, that it adds a certain amount of reinforcement and strength to the fly. But it takes a little while to not only get this done, but to get used to, separating this and being able to do this a little bit quicker. So I've got 4 wraps in there. I think that's good enough. The wire in the rib is mostly reinforcement for that hide. Just stroking this hair back, trying to get it kind of out of the way. If you've ever worked with rabbit before, you know it kind of gets wispy and all over the place. Got some trapped under that wire. You can pull that a little bit to get that back out from under the wire. Same time, when you see the fly done, you'll understand I don't think it really matters, because this is, I wouldn't say a messy fly, but it's got a lot going on, and in the water, it just moves all over the place. So between the hair and the marabou and the flash and the rubber legs, there's just a lot going on with this fly. So now we're ready for the rubber legs. I'm using some Sili legs. These are a pumpkin Sili leg with a copper flake in them. I'm going to use 3 of them. When I tie these in, I want these more or less to be oriented towards the bottom. So I'm going to tie these with the length a little bit longer than the overall tail. When you're tying this all in up here by the cone, by the way, you do want to try and minimize how wide this tie-in area gets. And I'm going to bring these over to the other side a little bit and anchor those down, and then trim those if they are a little too long. They're really not bad, but I'm going to trim that just 1. So there's our rubber legs. For the flash, I'm using some Flashabou, and I'm using actually a holographic copper Flashabou. You really only need about 4 or 5 strands, but you do want to get enough to get it all the way around the fly. A lot of times you tie this in and you're putting it just in one area, and having it come out in one area. This one we kind of want to maybe get a little bit more, 7 or 8. If you got 10 strands, I don't think it's that big of a deal. I don't think it's going to hurt the fly. But you want to get enough so that I'm going to tie this in so it's about the length of the tail. And initially I'm just going to tie it on this side right here. You can do this however you're comfortable. And I'm going to get a couple of wraps in to kind of collect that down. Then I'm going to take my thumb, kind of scooch this around, that Flashabou around, so that some of it comes up around the top here and some of the bottom. Put another wrap in to kind of secure that. Now I'm going to flip it over I'm going to bring all of that Flashabou up and around onto this side and get a few wraps in to kind of secure that. The idea is that the Flashabou isn't just coming out of the bottom or out of the top. It kind of wraps around the fly. Then I will trim the Flashabou a little bit longer than the tail, and I like to trim those a little uneven. So now we put in our final material, which is some Marabou. Again, notice that this tie-in area here, I'm trying to keep that as narrow as possible and minimize that. I'm using some Marabou here, and this happens to be a little piece of a package of strung Marabou off of some very short turkey, because these are some of the shortest little Marabou feathers I've ever seen. But they work perfect for this because all we're doing is putting in a little bit of Marabou on each side. To add some life. In his instructions in his book, he puts them on the bottom and then on the top. Because of this hook point, I find it kind of cumbersome, so I like to do them on the sides. The idea is that you tie these in. Same thing with the Flashabou. You can take your thumbnail, kind of scooch those around so that they wrap around the sides. Also, you can sometimes use the back edge of your scissors like this to kind of scooch those around. A couple wraps to secure that, and then trim away the excess. Notice that when I trimmed the excess, I didn't trim it real close to that cone. When I start to wrap this in, the thread's actually going to slip down in that cone and pull these butt ends of Marabou. If you cut it off real tight here, sometimes the thread pops off the Marabou and the Marabou comes out. So I leave a little bit of extra, plus that Marabou will kind of get wedged up in that cone. I'm going to take our second Marabou feather, same thing. I'm going to measure it so it goes just a little bit past the bend of the hook. Few wraps to secure it. Use my thumb, kind of spread that around a little bit. And a couple more wraps to secure that. Then I'll trim this as well. So now I've got the Marabou in, got all my materials in. I want to secure that Marabou down. You'll notice right there, like I said, there's a lot going on this fly. Keeping a lot of this out of the way as you're doing it can be a challenge. See, that thread just popped down into that cone. And I'm actually wrapping some thread wraps in under that cone. Notice that cone's getting more and more stable. And then a little bit, a few wraps right on the outside here. Again, you want to be careful to keep this area right here narrow. I don't think it's a big deal if it's a little bit wider, but you do want to try and keep it narrow. I'm throwing in some head cement just to soak down in there on all of that. Yeah, that cone's getting much more secure. So we're going to finish this off. You can leave it like this if you want, just do a whip finish and it's done. But you can also take some of your rabbit, that little piece that I told you about isn't going to go to waste. That I'm going to dub on the thread just to cover up those thread wraps. And another reason why you want to keep that area as narrow as possible. So I just trimmed the hide off of there. Dub a little dubbing noodle, a sparse dubbing noodle. of this rabbit, and I'll probably make this 4 or 5 inches so that I have plenty to put in half dozen wraps or so and cover up those thread wraps and build that area up so it looks like the body, all of this area here that's the body, naturally has a nice smooth taper and transition down to the cone. Probably have a little bit too much. Now, with my thread right up against that cone, I'll put in a 4 or 5 turn whip finish. Trim away my thread. A little bit more head cement right in there. And our meat whistle is done. You can, if you want, these thread wraps right up here. I think he uses some solar res to protect those thread wraps because this is going to be bouncing on the bottom. I'm just going to put a little bit of hard as hull on here. It's a hard finishing cement, just mostly because it's what I have right here handy. So I'm just going to pop a little bit of hard as hull. And what this does, it just gives the thread a bit of an outer protection. It doesn't necessarily shine it up or anything. I don't think that's necessary in terms of the meat whistle, but it's going to protect those threads a little bit as this bounces around on the bottom. So there is the Barr's meat whistle. Excellent book, The Barr Flies. John has done a lot of flies, great flies for trout. The meat whistle is a good trout fly, as well as I have had good luck as a warm water fly for different panfish, as well as some bass and various warm water species. Popular colors: olive, black, the brown are all popular colors for Barr's meat whistle. You don't have to be trimming all of this off. I'm doing it just to make it look a little bit neater, a little cleaner. But there you go. There is the Barr's meat whistle. Thanks for watching today.
Thanks for joining me at the Vise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.